Good morning to our friends in Mexico and Colombia. Sorry, good afternoon, and good morning to our colleagues here in Australia. My name's Richard Simonitis, and I'm the CEO of AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre. Today we'll be speaking with you about canola oil and canola meal out of Australia, and how we can add value to your economic production by using canola oil and meal out of Australia. I'd like to just take a couple of moments, please, to remind everybody that we are running interpretation today. So please choose the globe icon in the bottom of your screen on the far right and select your language of choice and mute the background, and then you'll be able to hear the interpretation clearly. We will have a question and answer session today, so please post any questions that you have in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pick those up and have a hosted question and answer session towards the end of the webinar today. We'll also run a small poll at the end of the webinar today, so we'll ask you all please to spend another couple of minutes just to stay online and complete that poll once the program is finished. So it's my job today to introduce our speakers, and I'll start with Mary Rains, who is the Barley Markets Manager at AGIC. And Mary has broad experience in coarse grains across Australia and has worked for many industry bodies. And Mary's role is to understand what the requirements of our customers are, and then to work with industry in Australia to present a value proposition back to our customers and to provide the technical support to help customers buying Australian grain be more profitable. After Mary will be Nick Goddard. So Nick is the CEO of the Australian Oilseeds Federation, and Nick was the guy that actually introduced canola to Australia in 1985, where he was working in marketing role in multinational food organisations, and he has a long career in the value adding end of the grains industry and takes a whole of supply chain approach. Australian Oilseeds Federation works through the supply chain all the way from the producer to the end user and takes a whole of value chain approach to everything that they do. So Nick has a wealth of experience there, and he'll give us an overview of the Australian canola industry today. Next, we'll hear from Pat O'Shannessy, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Grain Trade Australia, previous Director of Grain Trade Australia, previous Director of Australian Grains Exporters Association. And Nick has a long international career in grain trading, in trading policy, in strategy, in investment services in the grain industry, in origination, marketing and trading. So very well qualified today to speak to us about how the Australian grains industry works to manage the quality all the way through the supply chain to the customer. We'll then hear from Dr. Kate Macon. So Kate has her doctorate in veterinary science and has, in her early days, was teaching in that field, and is now the agriculture counsellor for Central America, Mexico and Colombia, based in the embassy in Mexico. So Kate has been working for about 13 years now with the Department for Agriculture, Water and Environment, and has broad experience over that time in exports, in quarantine, in biosecurity, in policy and market access, and in crisis management. So she's very well qualified today to speak with us about meeting Mexico's importing country requirements. After Kate, Tony Russell will host our Q&A sessions. So Tony is the CEO of the Grains Industry Market Access Forum, GMAF. And GMAF works with industry to inform government around market access issues. Tony's had a long career in the grains industry. He's worked in product development, he's worked in market development internationally, in marketing and trading, and has held various executive positions over that time. So Tony will host the Q&A session. Our close today will be from Craig Ford, the Trade and Investment Commissioner, based in Mexico and covering Latin America. So Craig has a background in startups, in information systems, in the knowledge economy, and has previously worked into Latin America from his base in Queensland. So understands those markets really well, and is a big advocate for advancing technology and manufacturing in Australia, so brings that background to the role. And I'd like to introduce the ambassador to Mexico, Remo Moretas, who'll make the official welcome today. Hello, Remo, great to see you there. And Remo has spent an entire career in diplomacy in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. In that time, he's worked in alignment with the World Trade Organization in Europe, in UK and Ireland, in New Zealand and in USA, in trade roles, and brings a wealth of experience to the table today. So Remo, thanks for taking the time to join us today, and I'll hand over to you to give the official welcome and commence the proceedings. And we'll need you to unmute, please, mate.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so thank you, Richard, and welcome everyone to all the speakers, the organisers of the event, and to the participants. Buenas tardes a todos los que nos acompañan desde México y Colombia, y buenos días a los que nos acompañan desde Australia. Mi nombre es Remo Morete, soy el embajador de Australia en México, concurrente Centroamérica, Cuba y la República Dominicana. Es un gran placer para mí darles la bienvenida a este seminario web organizado por el Centro de Innovación de Exportación de Granos de Australia y nuestras embajadas en México y Colombia. La relación agrícola entre nuestros países es fuerte y creciente. Hemos estado colaborando en algunos temas importantes de bioseguridad y en el crecimiento del comercio agrícola. Con México, el Tratado Integral y Progresista de Asociación Transpacífico, o CPTPP por sus siglas en inglés, ha creado una serie de oportunidades para que ambos países amplíen el acceso al mercado y diversifiquen el comercio, y esperamos que la finalización de las negociaciones de la Alianza del Pacífico ofrezca oportunidades similares para Colombia y Australia. Estoy muy entusiasmado por esta oportunidad de compartir con ustedes información sobre la canola australiana y aprender más sobre la industria canola en México y Colombia. Ahora cedo la palabra a nuestro maestro de ceremonias, Richard Simonaitis, y les agradezco de nuevo su asistencia. Muchísimas gracias a todos y todas.
Thank you very much, Remo, and I'll hand through to Mary Rains, the Markets Manager for AGIC, to commence her presentation. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Richard. All our friends in Mexico and Colombia, it's great for you. We're great that you're here with us today, and welcome to everybody from Australia. My name is Mary Rains, and I'm the Markets Manager for AGIC. I'm going to talk to you today about the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre in my presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Australian grains industry and how we offer value to our customers. So when we look at AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, we are the technical lead for market engagement that supports the Australian grains industry. We're an independent, non-for-profit company. We are funded by the Australian government and by the Australian grain growers. We were first established in 2012 to increase value to our Australian grains industry, both at a domestic and international level. We work across all grain crops of wheat, barley, canola, pulses, to a lesser degree, sorghum, predominantly in oats as well. So we work across all the grain crops here, in the major grain crops here in Australia. In our organisation, we have offices in Perth and on the East Coast in Sydney, and our facilities include research laboratories, pilot milling and pilot bakery. And we work to understand what our technical and quality requirements are of our customers and to add value to our customers of Australian grain. So as our operating model here at AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, it first starts with our market intelligence people. So like myself, we're normally in market, we will engage with customers, talk to customers, learn about what their business requirements are, as I said, what their technical and quality requirements are and what they want to achieve out of their businesses, and also identify if there's any obstacles to achieve those objectives. So we bring that market intelligence back down into AGIC, like our market analysis team. We then listen to what our stakeholders are saying, and then we work to identify what our value proposition is for our customers. So we chat to our technical people, we talk amongst our economics people, and then we just use the intelligence and the market information that we've got to develop propositions. So how we can best improve the consumption of canola in the pig diets. So we bring back all this information, then we take these value propositions and we take them back up to our customers like yourselves in Mexico and Canola, and we present these value opportunities and propositions to see what best suits your market. And we do that and some of the operations that we do is providing technical engagement activities like ourselves, like this one here. We also do technical hands-on training. So, how to use wheat for bread, how to use wheat for noodles, and how to best extract wheat for cookies as well. So we work across all the grain crops in terms of that market engagement, that technical engagement to support and provide those value propositions to our customers of Australian grain. So we're funded, as I said, by the Australian government and by the Australian grain growers such as GRDC, so that we get best value for all our grain growers in Australia. And we provide that value to our customers of Australian grain like yourselves. So when we look at the value of the Australian grains industry, we look at we have a really collaborative Australian grains industry to support our customers and our trade. So we start with the Australian government. You're going to hear more from Dr. Kate Macon today, where we've got the Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, our Foreign Affairs and Trade, and our Trade Commissioners, all working with policies and government-to-government relationships to ensure that trade can be successful. You'll hear more from Grain Trade Australia CEO Pat O'Shannessy, as Richard introduced at the start. So they represent over 95% of the grain that's traded in Australia. So this is the value. We all work together. We've got the Grains Research Development Corporation, which is the peak industry body for grains research. They invest in funding both at the agronomic, pre-breeding, genetics and genomics level to also into the post-farm gate level. We've also got our peak industry bodies that work together with the whole of the industry to represent the organisations such as Grains Australia, Grains Industry Market Access Forum, and you'll hear more from the Australian you'll hear more from the Australian Canola Federation later today as well. We also, to add value to our customers, we've got commercial breeding companies, and in the case of canola, we've got SeedNet, Pioneer, New Seed, BASF and Bayer. So all these seed companies work together with our peak industry bodies, our Grains Research Organisation, our trade and our Australian government to provide that extra value to our customers of the Australian grains industry. We also have their AGIC. We are the technical lead for market engagement and education and value propositions around how to best utilise Australian grains in your business. So we're a collaborative country that provide that opportunity and that support to our customers. When you look at the Australian grains industry, this is a map of Australia. The shaded area of the map is where grain is grown, as I said, across Australia. And Australia is just under 4,000 kilometres east-west. So I think it's about just under 3 times larger than Mexico. We plant over 22 million hectares of commercial grain crops per year, around 22. And then we also, being in Australia, we have such a diverse cropping region. So we have diverse soil types, climatic conditions, farming systems and markets. In Australia, we plant our crops in what we call our winter. So it's our April, May, and we harvest our crops in November, December. So in our summer hot months. In Australia, on the map here, not only have I demonstrated where predominantly our grain crops are grown, the red dots on our map indicate where we export our grain from as well. So we can see Australia is a large country that has diverse soil types, conditions, and for our diverse portfolio of grain. Just to give you an indication about, for those that aren't familiar with the Australian grains industry and our production, over the last 5 years, Australia's produced on average 52 million tonnes of grain. We're dominantly a wheat producing country, followed by barley, but canola represents 8% of our production in Australia, followed by pulses, oats. So we are a large producer of grain. We're also a large net exporter of grain. When you look at the quality and strengths of the Australian grains industry, we provide that quality assurance. We work to provide grain that is safe and dry for food and feed consumption. In Australia, we have a very, very innovative supply chain system that we can maintain variety purity. Australia has adopted that International Sustainability of Carbon certification scheme to ensure the quality of our grain. You'll hear more about our supply chain system and how it is very much a self-improving supply chain system. And the benefit of the Australian grains industry is that we produce accurate crop updates. These are produced by our Australian government with input from our industry. They are trusted information that is updated and released quarterly. To support that country crop updates, we also here at AGIC present the virtual crop updates to give you that insights to actually what is happening in the field at real life moments. So we supply that information to our customers of Australian grain across Southeast Asia, Africa, India, and also into Latin America. So here, I suppose the other attribute that I really wanted to point home is that the Australian grains industry, we're engaged to add value to yourselves in Mexico and Colombia of our products, because we want you to really gain value for your businesses as well. One of the ways that we add value to our customers to demonstrate it, AGIC's been with industry, have been leading some feed grain seminars since across Southeast Asia since 2017. So how to maximise the use of barley in pigs, or into using enzymes in the production for broilers and layers, or it could be into the high-end aquaculture, or we have technical experts that provide that information and that education to customers like yourselves. So we've gained great exposure. We provide that really informative technical support to our customers in our technical webinars and presentations. And if we were to do that for Mexico, like an example is how to use the Australian canola meal for the Mexico dairy industry. We provide a webinar. You know, we know that canola meal is a well-balanced source of ruminant degradable protein and digestible undegradable protein. We know that canola meal for the dairy diets in Mexico can replace soybean meal with a positive response. We know that canola meal can be better balanced of amino acids for milk protein synthesizers than soybean meal. So we know that there is value in the canola meal produced in Australia for the Mexico dairy industry. We know that canola meal is highly palatable. It stimulates daily feed intakes for increased milk production and feed efficiencies. And we know that it increases ruminant buffering capacities, and it's a good source of phosphorus, and may be used as a primary protein supplement in lactating cows, transitioning cows, and calf diets. So we facilitate technical seminars where we demonstrate this value and to a greater depth of information as well. So this is just an example of one of the examples that we do here at AGIC that provides that value to our customers of the Australian grain. So just in summary, AGIC offers the technical support to customers of all Australian grains. We use the technical support to deepen the value proposition. You can see in Australia that we produce on average for the last 5 years over 52 million tonnes of grain. We are and we produce strong volumes of high quality food and feed grain that is safe for consumption. What I really wanted to demonstrate is that in Australia, we have that credible, accurate information that's well trusted, that's produced by the industry and also by the government. And in Australia, we continue to be a reliant net exporter of canola and other grains. And to add that value, it's a whole of industry approach from the Australian grains industry. So just in summary, that's my short presentation to demonstrate the value of the Australian grains industry to Mexico and Colombia. And so no matter what the requirement is, the Australian grains industry is here for you to extract full value for your business. Thanks very much, Richard. Now I'd like to hand over to Nick Goddard, the CEO of the Australian Oilseeds Federation. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Mary, and good afternoon, everyone, to our friends in Mexico. I'm Nick Goddard. I'm the CEO of the Australian Oilseeds Federation, which is the peak industry body for oilseeds in Australia. And my purpose today is to give you a brief overview of the Australian canola industry. Firstly, just a little bit about the Australian, I'm just having trouble advancing my slides here. Here we go. Firstly, just a snapshot of the Australian Oilseeds Federation. It's the peak industry body, as I think Mary indicated. The industry association has been going now for over 50 years, representing the interests of the Australian oilseed industry and its customers. Its main purpose is to facilitate linkages and communication across the value chain. So we are a whole of value chain organisation representing all stakeholders throughout that value chain. And we very much take a whole of industry approach when we undertake projects. So it has to benefit not just one section at the disadvantage to another. Anything we do needs to ensure it benefits the whole industry value chain. And we are an independent and a credible voice to government and to other stakeholders such as AGIC. A little bit about canola production in Australia. This map mirrors the map of Mary's that Mary showed just recently. But what it's showing is the difference between the summer and the winter cropping situation in Australia. We have 7 states in Australia indicated by those letters: Queensland, New South Wales, SA, NT, and Western Australia. And the northern part of New South Wales and Queensland are both summer and winter cropping regions. And we have summer crops such as sorghum, cotton, and corn. And the shaded green area is very much the winter cropping area, of which dominated by wheat and barley. But we are looking at canola at around 8 to 10% of the total cropping area. And this year it's closer to 10%. In a typical year, it's about 8% of the area. You'd be very familiar with the Canadian canola cropping cycle. And even though we are on the other side of the world, our cropping cycle pretty much mirrors that of Canada, in that we plant in April, May, and we harvest in October, November. So pretty much the same as Canada, but some significant differences in terms of things like daylight hours. So, for example, I've just put here the solstice for summer and winter, and Saskatoon will get something like 16 hours of sunlight, 16 and more than 16 hours of sunlight in summer, whereas we'll get only 12 hours of sunlight as we're heading into our summer. And similarly in the winter period, as Canada heads into harvest, they still have around 12 hours of daylight, but Australia in the peak of its winter only about 9 or 10 hours of daylight, sunlight. So we have a very different crop phenology to Canada, but I guess the key point from this slide is that our season pretty much mirrors that of Canada. If we look at the Australian crop of canola, it sits between 1 to 2 billion US dollars. So we typically say it's around $1.5 billion US dollars is the value. And you can see there that the tonnes produced annually range between 3 and 4.5 million tonnes. Or having said that, this year will be much closer to 5 million tonnes. So a fairly consistent and robust production level. One of the things, because of the seasonal variation we have in Australia, we are highly dependent on rainfall. And you can see here that in periods of good rainfall, we get large crops, and periods of hot, dry conditions, the production is reduced. So we are fortunate this year and the last couple of years that we've been in a period of good solid rainfall throughout the growing season. All the canola crops are all rain fed, not irrigated. So we rely heavily on rain. And you can see there the response to rain. So this year, a very, very wet year, production close to 5 million tonnes. Something's going on with the slide here. If we just look at the Australian canola production, as I said, about 2 to 4 million tonnes. Our domestic demand is around 1 million tonnes. So every year we have an exportable surplus, and as the crop continues to grow, so too that exportable surplus continues to grow. So Australia is in a good position to be able to supply the Mexican market year in and year out. If we just look at our major export markets at the moment, if we look for the past 5 years, we see that Europe is our major customer, taking 80% of Australian exports, followed by China, Japan, and then some UAE and Nepal, and then others. So we are highly reliant on Europe as a destination market, but we would very much like to work with Mexico to ensure that next time this slide comes up, Mexico has got part of that, a wedge of that pie. One of the things we're very strong in Australia is about the quality of Australian canola. Each year we produce a publication called The Quality of Australian Canola based on the year's harvest. So the results we have at the moment are for the 2020 national crop, which is last year's harvest. To put it in perspective, we are just in the middle of harvest at the moment for the 2021. So this information for this year's harvest will be available around April next year. But the most recent information we have is this. And for last year, our oil content across the nation averaged just under 45%, with protein content in the meal a little over 38%. Glucosinolates remain low and continue low, similar to Canada at 10 millimoles, certainly less than the peak. Test weight of 67 kilograms per hectolitre, and an iodine value from last year's harvest of 115. So some of the technical people in the audience would understand the implications of being able to maintain and ensure an ongoing consistent iodine value, particularly for the food industry. We also have low chlorophyll levels in Australian canola because we are heading into summer. The crop is harvested coming into a dry period. Our chlorophyll levels are low, as are our moisture levels. So we have a maximum moisture level of 8%, but typically our exported canola is less than 5% moisture. So when you pay for Australian canola seed, you're paying for more oil and much less moisture than other markets. Another aspect of quality that we're very proud of in Australia is our ability to segregate between GM and non-GM. So the split in Australia at the moment is around 22% of the Australian crop is GM, that's Roundup Ready, but the balance, 78%, is non-GM. And we maintain a segregated supply chain throughout from farm gate through to export ports to ensure integrity of the non-GM seed. It should in situations where the market is requiring that. Another aspect we're very proud of in Australia with our canola is our sustainability credentials. We have a strong sustainability program, and that is very much driven by the food, feed, and beverage industry. And this covers both canola, barley, pulses, and wheat. But when it comes to canola, companies such as the companies presented here all participate in the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative, and they acknowledge and accept the ISCC, the German certification scheme ISCC, as being able to meet their sustainability requirements for vegetable oil. So all these companies are using vegetable oil in their formulations for their foods, and they accept the ISC certification that Australia has as being acceptable to meet their sustainability criteria. So when it comes to sustainable grain, what we're talking about here is grain that's produced to achievable standards that the growers can meet, but also standards that are recognised internationally by the food, feed, and beverage industries. As I have mentioned, and Mary also mentioned, we adopt the ISCC, the German ISCC scheme, stands for International Sustainability and Carbon Certification Scheme. This year, we have over 5,000 farms certified as sustainable through this program. And last year, we traded 3 million tonnes of ISCC certified grain. We haven't got the figures in for this year, and we'll have to wait till harvest is finished. But it covers a range of grains, including canola, barley, oats, pulses. I won't spend too long on this particular slide. You can read the key points, but the ISCC program is based on 6 key principles, and Australian farmers all meet these 6 principles in terms of, well, they need to meet these 6 principles in order to have their farm certified as sustainable, and their farms are then subject to an audit by an independent auditor to ensure that these requirements are being met. So if we look at the future of Australian canola, just generally with canola, we know that consumption of fats and oils around the world is growing, and canola is a key part of that growth story, particularly because of its health attributes. And those of you in the food industry would be well aware of the health benefits of canola, and all credit to the Canadian canola industry for continuing to promote the benefits of a canola in Mexico and in all its markets. Canola is grown sustainably, as opposed to a number of other oil seeds that are getting quite a lot of publicity, but canola is being able to demonstrate that it can be grown sustainably. And of course, canola provides a very high protein meal for both feed and also increasingly human food. Oops, I went a bit too far there. Just some of the aspects that we have on our radar as areas of caution for canola is that it is susceptible to changing climate. Australia, as I mentioned, is all rain-fed, so it relies on rainfall to grow, and changing climate could well impact both positively and negatively the ability of Australia to grow. We might end up growing canola in areas that previously was not suitable, which is certainly a benefit. We need to ensure, as a global industry, that canola maintains its share of the global oils and fats market, and we work hand in hand with our Canadian cousins to ensure that the good word about canola is spread around the world. We do have a very high reliance on biodiesel. While I have been talking about food, a large portion of the global canola market is going into biodiesel and renewable fuel, and that is a caution. And of course, as you're very familiar in Mexico, as we are in Australia, there is at times issues and community concerns, often unfounded, around the genetic modification and the use of glyphosate. So that is sort of a summary of what I'd like to present this afternoon on Australian canola. We will have an opportunity for questions at the end of this, and my contact details are also available on this slide and will be made available to you later. So thanks for your time. Thank you very much. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Pat O'Shannessy, the CEO of Grain Trade Australia. Pat, thanks.
Thanks, Nick, and hello everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today and to talk about the grain supply chain. Okay, we just got our slides. So I represent Grain Trade Australia. We're a trade organisation in Australia, and our members effectively operate the grain supply chain in terms of the storage and handling. And also you'll find that most of the exporters out of Australia will be members of Grain Trade Australia. Our core task is pretty simple. It's the facilitation of trade. So the way that we do that at GTA is in these areas. In Australia, the industry sets the trading standards. So we have committees of industry people, industry experts, that work through a process to review and set trading standards for grain that the farmers can produce, the supply chain can manage, meets importing country requirements, and also importantly has consumer markets at its heart and at its core. We also operate a standard set of trade rules and contracts within our industry. And this facilitates trade as most of the execution parts of the contract and the supply chain logistics part of the contract are very common. So at the end of the day, what the traders are really talking about is price, place, time of delivery, and that facilitates trade rather than negotiating every single contract at every single clause. We also operate a dispute resolution system for our industry. And I think the value of that can often be represented. The fact that there is a industry-driven way of getting commercial disputes resolved if one party to a contract is not doing its side of the deal underpins our industry and allows us to trade with confidence that the contracts can either be executed or financial compensation guaranteed. We do a lot of work around trade access, market access and policy work, and also provide industry stewardship through a grains industry code of practice, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You put all that together, and what you have is an industry-driven, self-regulated framework. So a lot of the areas in the Australian industry are actually managed by industry itself, whereas in other countries you'll find that government may play a part in many of those areas as well. I mentioned the Australian Grains Industry Code of Practice. All GTA members must adhere to the Australian Grains Industry Code of Practice. And you'll see here as well that the Code of Practice is endorsed by the Australian Department of Agriculture. Our Code of Practice looks at how the grain is managed, the quality assurance processes through the supply chain. It has production guidelines, guidelines around harvesting and storing grain, how to sample and test grain, grain storage and hygiene, use of chemicals on farm, but also use of chemicals in terms of managing grain in storage. Receiving grain, storing grain, and outturning grain is the processes that are all outlined in the Code of Practice and also in marketing grain. So this document is very important, and it is, in fact, underpins the way that our customers can have confidence in the Australian grain supply chain. Nick Goddard just mentioned around that in Australia we have GM canola and we also have non-GM canola. We call that market choice, and we have a framework within our industry that outlines how this is managed through the industry. And I think Nick made the point that we have segregated supply chains to ensure that the GM canola and the non-GM canola are kept separate from themselves, and in fact separate from all other grains that are managed through our supply chain. So the industry has a framework, it's called market choice. There's a little picture of it here about how to manage that grain through the supply chain to ensure the integrity of the GM and the non-GM lines. Just a quick slide in terms of our exports, and you'll see, I think we've exporting 2 to 4 million tonnes of canola a year. The industry, our exports actually mirror our production, if you like, around the peak. So this last year, we exported around 39 million tonnes of grain a peak. And with the production this year in Australia, roughly around 54 million tonnes of all grains, we look forward to another strong year of exports out of Australia. Our main crops being wheat, barley and canola for export. I think we've touched on those statistics there. Again, I mentioned about 1.5 to 3 million tonnes of grain, of canola exported every year. One point I think to make with the exports of Australian grain, in fact, the production, is that our producers have got more efficient at producing our grain more reliably and effectively producing more grain with less water. And that's due to significant changes in science, research and development, farming practices, and I think is something that really to behold and to congratulate our farmers with. There's a couple of key areas and key strengths of Australian grains. Now, these points here, I think, apply whether you're buying canola out of Australia, wheat, barley, any commodity. Our grains are produced in a clean, safe environment. We have high quality products and our supply chain operates in a very reliable way. So you can have some confidence in the delivery and the quality assurance of the grain that moves through that supply chain. That's in part through to the code of practice and also to the reliability of the counterparties and the contracts and trade rules that exist across our supply chain. So we have commonality and also consistent processes to ensure that that grain can be handled and received and consumed with confidence. Nick Goddard has touched on a couple of areas around the quality aspects of Australian canola. I won't really mention much more there, but I think the point about buying grain out of Australia, it's low in moisture, so getting more product, less water for all the grain canola that you may be looking at. So I've mentioned about the quality assurance processes in our supply chain. And I think what I want to look at here is a little bit around the industry-driven aspects and government inspections. And we have a government speaker coming up in a few minutes to talk more about that. But the point of Australian grain and coming out of our supply chain and produced in Australia is it's food safe. And the government are involved in inspecting grain at the point of export only for quarantine purposes. Every truckload of grain that is produced in Australia, be it canola, wheat, barley, oats, sorghum, every truckload of grain that is produced in Australia is sampled and tested at the point of receival. That grain is also sampled, tested and managed at various points through the supply chain in storage up to the point of export as well. So the quality assurance processes across industry and across government are very intense, I suppose, but managed at every point of the supply chain to know and make sure that the grain that is being selected for export markets meets the importing country requirements. On the farm, our producers, as I mentioned, are producing more grain with less water. That's due in part to a significant investment in research and development, and also in terms of our growers growing their grain in accordance with this guideline document, managing weeds, pests and diseases, complying with chemical uses around prescribed label uses, and following this guide around growing Australian grain. As I said, our grain is produced in a nice, clean, safe environment and managed in accordance with industry standards. Post the farm, the grain is received, tested, segregated according to its quality. So for different qualities, different types, I think in canola, a very clear example is managing the genetically modified seed and the non-GM seed separately. Accumulation is based on the customer requirements and the importing country requirements as well. And at the point of shipping, the grain is inspected by the Australian government to ensure that, and certified to ensure that it meets the importing country requirements, and also in terms of the commercial requirements of the customer. So I hope you can see that there's reasons to have some confidence around the grain that's coming out of Australia and the canola. And I think that confidence creates value, because if you don't have confidence, if you're not certain about that, you're pricing in risk that something might go wrong, be it the delivery, the payment, contractual terms, safety, quality assurance, logistics. Having more confidence and understanding about that supply chain increases the value for you, the customer, and also increases the value for our farmers in Australia. And I think with this confidence, the way we tend to look at it is you try something once, you sort of get a feel for it. You try something twice, you get some reliability, you sort of know what you're getting. And the third and the fourth time, you're building a reputation. And finally, you have the confidence to know that when you're buying that grain, when you're buying that canola, you know what you're getting. You know how it's going to perform. You know what you're going to be able to extract out of it at the other end. And so we hope with that, there's value for customers. And quite simply, we look forward to growing the tonnes transacted out of Australia into Mexico. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And I hope you've been able to sort of see the quality assurance processes in our supply chain. My job now is to hand over to Dr. Kate Markin from the Australian government. Kate's in the Australian Embassy in Mexico City, and she'll talk to you about the government processes. Thanks, Kate.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, everyone. So yes, my name is Kate Macon. I am the Agriculture Counsellor at the Embassy of Australia in Mexico City, and I also look after Central America and Colombia. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'll be talking a little bit about how Australia meets importing country requirements for canola and for other grains. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment's role in grain trade is to engage and support the grains export industry and to regulate and certify grain exports. We also work to gain, maintain and improve market access, and we contribute to the development of international standards through the IPPC and the ISPM standards. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are Mexico's importing country requirements for canola coming from Australia for processing and or consumption. Seneseca require a phytosanitary certificate issued by the department, a phytosanitary inspection at the point of entry into Mexico, phytosanitary treatment with either methyl bromide or aluminium phosphide, and the latter of those two can be applied during transit from Australia to Mexico. There's also sampling for entomology, excuse me, and the consignment must be free from soil contamination. So it's important that any prospective importers of canola take the time to check the conditions on the Seneseca website. Australian exporters will also check the requirements on our department's MyCore database. And if there's any questions or inconsistency with those conditions, exporters can contact the Grain Export Program in Canberra, and their email is shown on the screen here. It is grain.export@awe.gov.au. Next slide, please. Okay, so Australia's commitment to our trading partners is to ensure that there are no live injurious insects in our exported grains. And I'm now just going to go through a little bit about how we work with industry to achieve that. Next slide, please. Okay, the department has a 3-tick process for phytosanitary certification of grains. This includes registration of grain export establishments with regular audits, inspection of transport units prior to loading, an inspection of grains prior to export with zero tolerance for live injurious insects. Next slide, please. Some of the ways by which Australian exporters work to meet the importing country requirements are presenting export compliant goods for inspection prior to export, monitoring for and managing compliance in their own businesses, and sourcing grains from areas with low pest prevalence. Next slide, please. So just a little on Australia's legislation under the Export Control Act and the Export Control Rules for plants and plant products. Canola and many other grains are what we describe as prescribed goods. And as such, canola must be prepared in a registered establishment for export. The exporter must also be registered with the department and lodge a notice of intention to export the grains. The grains are inspected by authorized officers. The container or vessel is also inspected and approved. The description of the goods has to be accurate and compliant. And when all of these things are met, a phytosanitary certificate can be issued. Next slide, please. So on the last slide, I mentioned prescribed goods. So just quickly to mention that all of the plant products listed on this slide are prescribed goods, and as such, their export is subject to regulation by the department. And we also regulate the export of non-prescribed goods where the importing country requires some level of government oversight or supervision. Next slide, please. Okay, inspections are used to verify compliance with some phytosanitary requirements like treatment or degree of processing, freedom from contaminants, plant debris, and soil, absence of unauthorized plants, plant products, and other foreign matter, the consignment packaging and shipping requirements, the origin of the consignment or lots in the consignment, and approved points of entry and exit for some markets. Next slide, please. So as previously mentioned, the inspection of transport units is an important part of the process. Before containers and bulk vessels are loaded with compliant goods, they're thoroughly inspected by an authorized officer. For containers, that means an internal and external inspection of the container. And the authorized officers also inspect empty holds of bulk carriers, conveyors, and the flow path prior to loading of the goods. Next slide, please. So as part of the inspection and assessment process, exporters submit supporting documentation like grower declarations, area of freedom statements, and treatment certificates to the department. For diseases not detectable by sight, phytosanitary certificates can be issued based on laboratory test results, area of freedom certificates, crop inspection reports, or a combination of these. Then the grains are presented for inspection at a registered establishment. As I said previously, there's zero tolerance for live injurious insects, and any infested goods would not be permitted to leave Australia. But once the grain does pass all of the inspection processes, the authorized officer can submit an inspection report and issue the phytosanitary certificate. Next slide. Okay, so just before I finish up, I wanted to briefly mention the changes to Australia's export legislation that came into effect this year. We implemented a new Export Control Act and related legislation. The new legislation is easier to understand and use, but it doesn't change the department's role as the competent authority or any of our regulatory controls over exports. And the new legislation will continue to achieve the regulatory outcomes expected by our trading partners. Next slide, please. And just very quickly, this slide just shows that very minor cosmetic changes to the appearance of some of our phytosanitary certificates related to the new legislation. So as you can see, between the old and new crest, there's just a minor change of where the wording is positioned. These certificates are rolled out from March 2021, and the changes do not affect any of the negotiated attestations or consignment specific information that is printed on the certificates for market access. Next slide. Okay, so that's everything from me. Thank you everyone for listening. My contact details are there on the slide. If there's any assistance we can provide, please feel free to contact us. And now I'm going to hand over to Tony Russell, who is going to look after the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Kate. And look, I think we've had some really good presentations so far, and a lot of very good information's been imparted, perhaps so much so that there hasn't actually been any questions raised in our Q&A box there. So look, I invite anyone who has a question, who wants to expand upon any of the information that you've been provided so far, to insert your question into the chat box there. But I might start by just opening up and sort of expanding a little bit on some of the comments that our panelists so far have provided. And Nick, I just wouldn't mind sort of exploring a little bit this question that's sort of been talked about so much lately, and you have partly addressed this, and that relates to the whole question of sustainability of our agriculture and food supply systems. It's obviously become a major discussion point as global concerns about climate change have escalated very much so in recent times. We know that some countries are quite fixated on GM products, and in some ways the unrelated concerns about glyphosate, whether they're real or otherwise. I'm just wondering if you can comment to us in further detail as to how the Australian industry is responding and managing these concerns.
Sure, thanks, Tony. And I think it's worth putting it into the bigger picture context, and that is what community expectations are around sustainability. And so we're seeing community and society concerns around the sourcing of their food, and that is laddering back to the food suppliers, so the multinationals and the local companies, the Nestle's, the Frito-Lay's, the Unilevers of the world, are listening to their stakeholders, listening to their customers, listening to their shareholders, and acknowledging their concerns in this space, and therefore acting accordingly. So they are increasingly looking to source their raw materials, their agricultural inputs, under as certified sustainable inputs. We've seen this for a number of years now for things like coffee and cocoa, but now it's moved into the broader food and certainly the grains area. So this is why a scheme like the ISCC, and there are a number of other schemes, but schemes like this have become now growing importance to the food supply, including the grain space. So in Australia, we've adopted the ISCC scheme to certify the grains that are coming from Australian farms. Well, actually, it's certifying the Australian farms. It's not certifying the grain. So those farms are then certified and acknowledged as meeting the requirements of ISCC. And that then ticks the boxes very well for those food companies who have made these sort of public commitments. When it comes to issues like glyphosate, fortunately, schemes like ISCC and others are very much based in science, so they are not swayed so much by public opinion. And the use of chemicals such as glyphosate or technology such as GM is not seen to be, it's seen to be supported by the science and the evidence that these products are safe, and in fact, even more so, they are actually adding to the sustainability of the production of these crops through less use of pesticides, less need for tilling the soil, etc. So they're actually contributing towards sustainability. rather than anything negative.
Right, thank you, Nick. Just a further question there in relation to the ISCC certification system. I think you mentioned that currently Australia has about 5,000 farms that have been certified under this scheme. Is that still increasing? Do you see that increasing in number of farms, or have we pretty much plateaued out in terms of that scheme?
No, we're certainly seeing a growth in that. So these numbers are increasing. Obviously, this year for Australia is a large canola year. And canola is the main driver of the sustainability program because of the requirement to supply Europe with certified sustainable canola. So we have a large canola crop this year, many more farms growing canola, and therefore that's driving the growth that we're seeing at the moment in the number of farms that are applying to become certified. So it's still on a growth trajectory. It may in fact ease off next year if canola eases off, but of course then there are other crops such as barley and oats which could well take that space.
Great, thanks, Nick. And just I'll stay with you for a moment and just ask you a related question in relation to GM canola. I think your the chart that you put up indicated 22% of the current Australian crop is GM varieties. Do you see that that's likely to change, or do you have a view about where that might be going?
Yes, it has been slowly growing, but the most rapid growth was in those early years. We have now had one extra state that's been approved for GM crop, that being South Australia, and this is the first year that South Australia has come in. So those statistics that I was using are actually from 2018. They certainly don't reflect this year's crop, which we would expect to be a little higher, given that we now have an extra state that has got the access to this technology. So I think we'll probably see it level out around 25 to 30% of the Australian crop in due course. It's obviously a tactical tool, the use of Roundup Ready canola. It's not something that's used broadly across the whole planting regime, as we may see in Canada, or we may see with soybeans in Brazil or in the United States. It's used quite tactically by growers as a weed management technique, rather than something that's just adopted holus bolus.
Great, thanks, Nick. And look, we've had a couple of questions come in in the chat room, and I'll pose the first one of those, which is a question as to Mexico having emerged as a significant market for Australian malting barley. In fact, we're very happy to declare that Mexico is now the largest market for Australian malting barley, and that's a great outcome for our barley sector. So does this mean that there would be an opportunity for combination cargoes carrying barley and canola to be shipped to Mexico from Australian ports? Who would like to have a crack at that question? Do you think, Pat, maybe do you have a view about how that might work?
Yeah, Tony, it is interesting how barley's really working into Mexico quite well. The simple answer is yes. There will be opportunities for combo cargoes coming out, and obviously, you know, that will affect the freight rate that people can achieve. So what I would encourage people to do there is talk with the exporters out of Australia. You'll find that most exporters out of Australia, in fact, all the ones I can think of, will be able to supply canola and barley as well. So you'll be able to deal with one exporter out of Australia, and if those exporters will more than likely also be able to deal with more than one counterparty on the vessel as well. So it can be done. It's just a matter of talking to the exporters. I'd point people to the Grain Trade Australia website if you're looking for a list of people that can export out of Australia, our members there, and like I said earlier, all the major exporters out of Australia are members of GTA, so we'll have contacts on that website.
And just related to that, Pat, I mean, currently we've seen some extreme conditions applying in global shipping. So bulk freight, and in particular in container freight. How do you see that playing out in the near term? Do you see there are some difficulties that we've still got to work through, or do you see that that the flow will continue?
I think as that Chinese saying goes, we are living in interesting times, and that will continue in terms of the freight markets at the moment. The supply chain issues, it's easy to blame it on COVID, and that's not to say that it's not part of that issue, the congestion and so forth that we're seeing around the globe. But for the short term, I think that that freight will remain stressed. The simple cure for high prices in a market is high prices. It'll eventually work itself out, but coming out of Australia for the next year, we're going to have a very busy export program, and you know, there are obviously, there have been issues in North America and Canada and so forth around their exports, but you know, it will be quite tight. But it's about planning, I think, and probably in this environment allowing a little bit more time than usual to ensure that there is a little bit of room there for things to get delayed logistically, particularly in the freight side.
Yeah, and we have had just a related question to this shipping opportunity. As it's really about whether that the market to Mexico, do we see it likely to evolve and develop via bulk, or do we think it probably will start with containers? My understanding is that we haven't shipped any canola to Mexico for at least 20 years. I think we did sell canola back in 1999 or 2000.
Yeah.
Is it likely that a market that's hasn't been taking Australian canola in recent times would develop in containers, or do you think it's more likely to occur in bulk, even if it's a single hatch on a vessel?
I think probably in a more traditional time, if you like, without the issues that we've got in global freight and container markets, we would have seen it sort of commence in containers. And the reason you say that is, you know, there's less at risk, there's less working capital, there's, you know, more of a trial process. About 12% of grain out of Australia leaves our shores in containers. And on the east coast of Australia, that's about 30 to 40%. So we do have a pretty well-developed container market. And I think that, you know, I'm not too sure whether there'd be a direct shipping line service from Australia into Mexico, but I think it's certainly something that if people have interest in that we can do some more work on that, and also talking to the exporters out of Australia. Again, people will be able to do bulk or contain, you know, talk about containers. It's all something that if people are looking at that, then that certainly should be explored to see how those rates stack up. At the end of the day, probably the most economically viable one will be the one that wins. We work in an industry that you know, price is very important.
Thanks, Pat. Mary, I've got a curly one for you, perhaps. I'm just interested if you could give your perspective on how farmers, Australian farmers, decide on which crops to grow, whether they grow wheat, barley, canola, oats, or pulses. What determines their decision making for what crops they grow?
Good question, Tony. Well, ultimately, everybody wants a return on investment on every hectare of land they've got. So it's all the common denominator driver is price, but you need to set price aside to look at cropping rotations and soil types and environments. So we're very fortunate in Australia. We can grow a lot. Some farmers can have a wide cropping rotation, which can include wheat, followed by a pulse crop, be that lentils or chickpeas, which is gazabo beans in Mexico, or it could be for canola. So What determines what growers plant will be what their cropping rotations are in their farm planning systems, because they set that out at the year, what weed controls they want to manage, also what they think the season's going to return them the best price on their grain, and what crop they can actually grow successfully in their environment, because we have farmers on the East Coast that have alkaline soil, so they can grow anywhere between all cereals, pulses, and canola. But then there's some farmers on the West Coast that could have a little bit of sand, so not very favourable to pulses. So there's a lot of different attributes that determine what a farmer will plant. And again, it's, as I said, it's all about maximising his returns on investments in his farming systems. So if canola is looking good and it's short globally, and they can grow it successfully, like a variety suits their environment, rainfall can vary between 325 millimetres in Australia up to 600 millimetres in Australia. So and then if they want to manage their disease, so there's a lot of different attributes, but there will be, so predominantly it's price, it's also rotation, so looking after soil fertility, soil health, nutrition, it's minimising their inputs to maximise their outputs.
Great, thank you, Mary. Look, Kate, I don't know if you have enough knowledge to answer this question, but you are on the ground in Mexico. You may have a perspective on some of the animal feeding sectors in Mexico. Can you tell us whether there are other potential end users for canola meal, for example, poultry, the poultry sector, for example, that would consume canola meal?
Yeah. Look, Mexico does have a large animal agriculture sector. They're the world's 7th biggest producer of chicken meat, 6th biggest for beef, and 6th largest for table eggs. And there's significant trade in feed grains between Canada, the US, and into Mexico. So I think there's potential there. It is another opportunity that we're looking into for Australia's grain exports to Mexico. So we can put some more information together and reply to the attendees on that.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. We've had a question.
Sorry,
yes,
Tony, I was just going to say it might be a good topic for a future, more detailed technical webinar, perhaps.
Yeah, AGIC is certainly well structured and got great experience in providing that type of support, I know. So yeah, that would be an opportunity if the interest was there, I'm sure, and you'll be able to jump all over that one, Richard. A question from Colombia, from Iraq Mayer from Colombia. The question relates to the Department of the Embassy that could action a plan to import Australian grains for the animal feed industry and brewing industry, and its subsequent technology transfer in terms of handling and manufacturing these products. I assume you might be able to help on that one, Kate.
Sure. So I am from my job is with the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment in Australia. So me and my team here, we look after technical market access requirements. So actually they're having the certificates and the access to get the product into the market. We have that established for some grains in Colombia. One of the limiting factors right now is that we don't have a free trade agreement with Colombia. As the ambassador mentioned in his opening remarks, we're hoping the Pacific Alliance Agreement would help that, but right now the tariffs that Colombia imposes are a bit limiting for some of the grains. So in addition to that, at the embassy in Mexico and also in Colombia, we have the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. So if there's interest in importing a product, the correct people to contact would be myself and my team, and also Camilo, who is the Austrade person at our embassy in Bogota.
Great, thanks, Kate. And I just wondered if you could expand upon any particular conditions in relation to canola imports into Mexico that you haven't mentioned. I know you just mentioned that potentially into Colombia, there's that we have tariff concerns. Is there any issues that we need to be aware of in exporting canola to Mexico?
No, I think the conditions are quite straightforward. They're very similar to the conditions we have for other grains like barley and oats. And we haven't had any technical issues with those products into Mexico. For Colombia, we don't currently have an agreed protocol for canola, but if there's strong interest and it's commercially viable, that's something we could look into trying to progress with them. We do have access for other grains to Colombia, like barley. Great,
thanks, Kate. Look, in the absence of any further questions, I think we're pretty close to done here. I don't know if anyone else has got any further questions to raise. Mary, you're putting your hand up.
Thanks, Tony. Often somebody's just mentioned where to next with these webinars, and AGIC's and Australia Grains Industry engagement with Mexico, Colombia over canola and canola meal. So where to next with following up from this? AGIC will send out a copy of this recording, but in the near future, we would look to do further engagement depending on what's required out of Mexico. So we'll send out the virtual crop updates to keep everybody informed of what's currently happening in Australia. And then we will then also do any other extra material and engagement activities if required, depending on where we're situated. But that's where AGIC does a lot of that technical market engagement. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, let's hope that we can generate some further interest, and AGIC can definitely get involved in trying to support that interest and getting everyone up to the necessary level of understanding of what Australian canola can offer consumers in Mexico very soon, we hope, and it might lead to some shipments of the 2021 crop, which is currently right in progress as we speak. So look, thanks everyone for your questions. I'll just have one more check to make sure there's no new questions come through. I can't see any. So thanks very much for those that have asked questions. I'd like now to invite Craig Ford to just quickly sum up and thank everyone for their participation in this webinar. So I'll pass over to you. Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate that. It was a very good session. Just a few words quickly for our Latin American audience in Spanish. Me llamo Craig Ford, trabajo para Australia. Sorry, I need to turn my interpretation off. I can hear it as I'm talking. Australia es la Oficina Internacional de Comercio y Inversión del Gobierno Australiano. I'm sorry, I'm still hearing that. Me gustaría aprovechar esta oportunidad para agradecer a todos por su participación hoy y agradecer al Centro de Innovación de Granos de Exportación de Australia por la organización del evento. Esta ha sido una excelente oportunidad para compartir información sobre la canola australiana y para aprender más sobre la industria canola de Colombia y México. Todos sabemos que el comercio mundial se ha enfrentado a 2 años difíciles, pero nuestras relaciones comerciales son sólidas y crecientes. Y espero que tengamos más eventos como el de hoy, y en el que exploremos las oportunidades de un comercio mutuamente beneficioso de productos agrícolas. Gracias a todos por asistir el día de hoy. And now in English very quickly for our Australian audience. And apologies for my lack of technology skills there. So for our Australian audience, look, thank you for your participation today. It really is encouraging to not only see interest, but a commitment of that interest to this region, which is lesser known than our traditional markets. We know we need to diversify, and we know the reasons why. I'd say the gains that we've made so far in barley, we believe can be replicated in canola and are being replicated in other grains categories. So I'm based in Mexico City, and my team member, Sagra Clorio, also on this call. Her and I are available to assist you in working in this region moving forward. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation.
Thanks very much, Craig. So that draws the proceedings to a close. Thanks very much to our friends in Mexico and Colombia and to our colleagues here in Australia. We'll just ask your indulgence to stay on for another couple of minutes and participate in our poll, and then everyone is free to leave after that. So thanks, Sean. Thanks very much, guys, who have added the content today. Much appreciated.